Miss Marple and the caroller who sang his last. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ali. Are you counting the days to the winter holidays, New Year and Christmas? Or do you prefer the easy warmth of summertime? Tell us below. And don't forget to subscribe so our cozy community can keep growing. Now, let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. The Carolers in the Snow. The snow had begun to fall at tea time, softly at first and now, as the early winter darkness settled over St. Mary Mead. The village presented a picture that might have graced any Christmas card. Miss Jane Marple, standing at her cottage window with a warm shawl about her shoulders, observed the scene with quiet satisfaction. The snow was the proper sort for Christmas Eve. She reflected not the heavy, troublesome kind that blocked roads and inconvenienced the postman, but rather those gentle flakes that drifted down like feathers from some celestial pillow. I really must be going, she murmured to herself, though there was no one to hear. The caroling begins at 7, and one does like to secure a good position near the church gate. She wrapped herself in her warmest coat, chose her sturdiest walking shoes despite their lack of elegance, and took up the small lantern that her nephew Raymond had given her the previous Christmas. A sensible gift, she had thought then, and sensible gifts were always the most useful. The village was already stirring with activity. When Miss Marple emerged onto the lane, lights glowed in cottage windows, and she could see figures moving about with purpose. The carol singing on Christmas Eve was a tradition in St. Mary Mead, stretching back longer than anyone could remember, and the villagers took it seriously. Mr. Hugh Barton, the schoolmaster, had led the carolers for the past 12 years, since the retirement of old Mr. Weatherby, and, under his direction, the singing had acquired a polish that was quite remarkable for a village gathering. Miss Marple proceeded at a careful pace along the snowy path. She passed the baker's shop, already closed for the evening, and the lending library where Mrs. Dane was just locking the door. A lovely evening for it. Miss Marple called Mrs. Dane cheerfully. Indeed it is, Miss Marple agreed. I do hope my voice holds out. It has been rather troublesome lately. Oh, we all sound better in a group, Mrs. Dane said with a laugh. That's the beauty of carols. By the time Miss Marple reached the church, quite a crowd had assembled. She recognized most of the faces, naturally. There was Colonel Melchett with his wife, both looking rather red-faced from the walk. The vicar, Mr. Clement, stood near the church door, greeting arrivals with his usual gentle manner. His wife was distributing printed carol sheets, though most of the villagers knew the words by heart. Miss Marple positioned herself near the lych gate, where she had a clear view of the proceedings. The choir, composed of the school children and several adult volunteers, was gathering in a semicircle near the church porch. Lanterns had been set on posts, creating pools of warm light that pushed back the darkness. Mr. Hugh Barton arrived a few minutes before 7, carrying his own lantern and a leather folder containing his music. He was a man of perhaps 45, with a pleasant, open face and greying hair that suggested scholarly pursuits. His voice, when he called out greetings to various members of the gathering, was warm and carried well across the churchyard. Miss Marple had always thought him an excellent schoolmaster, the sort who could maintain discipline without severity, and who genuinely cared for his pupils' welfare. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said, pausing beside her. "I'm so pleased you could join us." "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Mr. Barton," she replied. "Your caroling has become quite the finest in the county, I'm told." He smiled, though Miss Marple noticed something fleeting across his face, a shadow that might have been worry or preoccupation. You're very kind. I do hope we shall do justice to the old songs tonight." He moved on to organize his charges, and Miss Marple watched him with the attention she brought to most things. She observed that he glanced twice, toward the dark lane that led past the church, toward the Melchester Road, the second time. He held his gaze for several seconds, as though expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. When no one appeared, he turned back to the choir with what seemed like a small sigh. The children were arranging themselves according to height. Miss Marple recognized Peter Mills, the baker's boy, a gangly youth of about 14 who served in the choir despite a voice that was currently navigating the uncertain territory between boy, soprano, and something deeper. Young Emily Dane stood beside him, her face eager and bright in the lantern light. Near the back of the group, Miss Marple noticed a man she did not immediately recognize. He was perhaps 50, with a heavy build and a face that suggested he spent more time frowning than smiling. He wore a good coat, she noted, and carried himself with a certain assertiveness that bordered on aggression. When Mr. Barton spoke to him briefly, the man's response was curt, barely civil. "Who might that be?" Miss Marple murmured to Mrs. Bantry, who had just arrived beside her. "Oh, that's Mr. Kellum. He's bought the old Prescott farm just outside the village. Keeps himself to himself, mostly. His boy was in some trouble at the school recently. I believe something about an examination." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, thoughtfully. She also noticed a young woman standing somewhat apart from the main gathering near the church porch. The woman was neatly dressed in dark clothing and held a folder similar to Mr. Barton's, Miss Preston. Miss Marple recalled the school secretary, quiet, efficient person who had come to St. Mary Mead 3 years ago from somewhere in the north. She appeared nervous tonight. Miss Marple thought, her hands clutching the folder rather tightly. Mr. Barton raised his hand, and the murmuring crowd fell silent. "Thank you all for coming on this blessed Christmas Eve," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the still air. "We shall begin, as always, with Hark. The herald angels sing. The children raised their carol sheets, though most needed no such aid." Mr. Barton lifted his hand to give the starting note, and once again Miss Marple saw his eyes dart toward the dark lane. This time his expression suggested not merely expectation, but something closer to apprehension. Then he smiled, turned back to his singers, and brought down his hand. The voices rose together, pure and strong in the cold night air, and Miss Marple felt the familiar warmth that such moments always brought. She sang along quietly, her thin voice lost in the general chorus, but her eyes never left Mr. Hugh Barton. There was something about his manner tonight, something that reminded her of a young housemaid she had once employed, who had broken a valuable vase and spent 3 days waiting for it to be discovered. The snow continued to fall, soft and steady, and the carols rose toward the dark sky. Chapter 2, A Voice Silenced They, had progressed through 3 carols when it happened. The voices had blended beautifully on O Come, All the Faithful, and Mr. Barton had looked almost peaceful during the first verses earlier, attention seeming to ease as the familiar rhythms took hold. Miss Marple, observing from her position by the lich gate, had begun to think that whatever had troubled him earlier had been resolved, perhaps had never been more than her imagination. She should have known better. In her long experience, worry rarely dissolved of its own accord. They had just begun Hark. The herald angels sing when Peter Mills emerged from the church porch carrying a tray with several steaming cups. Miss Marple watched as the boy moved carefully through the snow, his face screwed up in concentration. He approached Mr. Barton and offered him a cup with a mumbled word she could not quite hear. Mr. Barton took it with a nod of thanks and drank deeply. He set the cup down on the low wall beside him and raised his hands to conduct the next verse. His voice, that fine, warm baritones, soared out over the others. Hark! The herald angels sing glory to the newborn King. They reached the second verse, the one about peace on earth and mercy mild. Mr. Barton's voice suddenly wavered on the word mild, an odd catch that might have been taken for emotion. Then his hand went to his throat. For a moment, no one seemed to notice. The singing continued around him, the children's voices pure and strong. But Miss Marple saw. She saw the way his face changed, the confusion that replaced the earlier animation. She saw him reach out as if to steady himself on the church wall. Then he fell. It was not a graceful collapse, not the sort of swoon one reads about in novels. He pitched forward into the snow with a horrible finality, and the carol died in a ragged chorus of gasps and cries. Mr. Barton, the vicar, was there first, kneeling in the snow beside the fallen man. Someone fetch Dr. Haydock quickly, now. Colonel Melchett pushed through the crowd with military efficiency. Stand back. Give him air. He knelt opposite the vicar and felt for a pulse at Barton's neck. His face, when he looked up, told its own story. Miss Preston had dropped her folder sheets of music, scattering across the snow. She stood frozen, one hand pressed to her mouth. Young Emily Dane was crying, and several of the other children had begun to wail. Peter Mills still held his Tratha remaining cups, trembling in his shaking hands. Miss Marple moved forward with deliberate steps, her elderly frame seeming frailer than usual in the confusion. No one paid her much attention. The crowd had surged toward the fallen schoolmaster, everyone talking at once, offering suggestions, calling out questions. In the chaos, Miss Marple bent down near Mr. Barton's head. His hymn sheet had fallen beside him, one corner soaking in the trampled snow, where someone's cup had spilled. She picked it up carefully, using only her fingertips, and as she brought it close, she caught a scent faint, but unmistakable to someone who had once nursed a distant cousin through an unfortunate incident, involving rat poison purchased for entirely innocent purposes, bitter almonds. She folded the sheet with care and slipped it into her coat pocket. Around her, the villagers were beginning to realize what Colonel Melchett had already understood. Hugh Barton was dead. Dr. Haydock arrived 5 minutes later, puffing from his hurried walk from the other end of the village. He knelt in the snow and conducted what examination he could under the circumstances. Miss Marple watched him carefully. He checked the pupils, felt the pulse points, opened the mouth, and peered inside. His expression grew increasingly troubled. "Heart failure," he said finally, rising to his feet with some difficulty. "Though it's dashed odd in a man of his age and constitution. I'll need to examine him properly, of course. He seemed perfectly well earlier," Mrs. Clement said tearfully. "He was at the vicarage just this afternoon, helping us arrange the altar flowers. These things can be sudden," Dr. Haydock said, but he sounded uncertain. The cold weather, the exertion of singing, some underlying condition we didn't know about. Miss Marple spoke quietly from her position slightly behind the doctor. "People rarely die at the exact moment of a high note," she murmured, "Doc." Dr. Haydock turned to look at her, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. "What's that, Miss Marple?" "Nothing of consequence, Doctor, merely an observation. I was thinking of my great-uncle, Henry, who was most fond of singing. He lived to be 93. The doctor grunted and turned back to his examination. But Miss Marple noticed that he looked more carefully at the mouth and sniffed once or twice, and then straightened with a distinctly troubled expression. "We'll need to move him to my surgery," he said, "and I shall have to notify the proper authorities. Colonel Melchett, might I have a word?" The two men moved aside, speaking in low tones. Miss Marple observed the way Dr. Haydock kept glancing back at the body, and the way Colonel Melchett's military bearing became even more pronounced as their conversation progressed. Around them, the villagers were beginning to disperse, shocked and uncertain. The vicar was attempting to comfort Miss Preston, who had begun to cry in great gulping sobs. Mr. Kellam stood apart from the others, his heavy face unreadable in the lantern light. When his eyes met Miss Marple's, he looked away quickly. Peter Mills had set down his tray and was being questioned by Mrs. Bantry, who had taken on the role of surrogate comforter in the absence of the boy's mother. Miss Marple moved closer, her steps slow and apparently aimless. "I was only doing what Mr. Barton asked," Peter was saying, his voice cracking. "He told me to fetch the cups from the church porch where they'd been left warming. Said we'd all need something to ward off the cold before we'd sung ourselves hoarse." "Who left them there?" Mrs. Bantry asked gently. "I don't know, ma'am. They were just there on the bench inside the porch, 6 cups, all steaming. I thought perhaps Mrs. Clement had left them, but Mrs. Clement, when consulted, knew nothing of any cups." The vicar confirmed that he had locked the church at 6 o'clock and had seen nothing on the porch bench at that time. Miss Marple listened to all of this while appearing to study the snow at her feet. She also noted that 1 cup remained on the tray untouched. The others had presumably been distributed to various members of the choir, though in the confusion no one seemed certain who had received what. The cup that Mr. Barton had used was nowhere to be seen. "Perhaps it rolled away when he fell," suggested Colonel Melchett, who had returned from his conference with the doctor. A search was instituted, but no cup was found in the immediate vicinity. The snow showed many footprints, now all confused and overlapping, making it impossible to determine any clear pattern of movement. Miss Marple stood quietly near the lich gate, watching the searchers. Her mind was arranging facts as she might arrange pieces on a chessboard. A man who had seemed worried, who had glanced repeatedly toward a dark lane as if expecting someone. Cups left mysteriously on a church porch. A death that occurred at a most convenient moment of convenience could be measured in such grim terms. And a missing cup that suggested someone had taken pains to remove evidence. "Dreadful business," said a voice beside her. She turned to find Mr. Kellam standing there, his breath making clouds in the cold air. "The boy's done for himself now, hasn't he?" "I beg your pardon," Miss Marple said mildly. "That Mills boy serving poisoned drinks." Kellam's tone was almost satisfied. "They'll sort it out soon enough. Boys that age, they don't think about consequences." He walked away before Miss Marple could respond. She watched him go, noting the way he glanced back at the church porch, and the way his hands were clenched at his sides. The snow had stopped falling. In the renewed stillness, the trampled churchyard looked tawdry rather than festive, the lanterns casting harsh shadows across the disturbed snow-dot Christmas. Eve had turned into something else entirely, something dark and troubling. Miss Marple touched the folded hymn sheet in her pocket and began the slow walk home. Chapter 3. The Hymn Sheet. Miss Marple did not sleep well that night, though that was hardly surprising. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to the old house settle around her, and thought about Hugh Barton falling into the snow. More particularly, she thought about the expression on his face in that final moment. the confusion and disbelief that suggested a man confronting something utterly unexpected. She rose at 7 earlier than her usual habit and made herself a pot of tea. While it steeped, she retrieved the hymn sheet from her coat pocket and spread it carefully onto the kitchen table. The early morning light through the window was thin and grey, but sufficient for her purposes. The sheet was damp along one edge as she had observed the previous evening. The dampness had a faintly sweet smell, overlaying something more acrid. Cider, she thought, warmed. Cider of the sort that had likely been in those cups. But there was something else, a residue that had dried in a faint crystalline pattern along the damp edge. She bent closer, her elderly eyes straining in the pale light. Yes, there it was, not on the paper itself, but transferred to it from the cup that had spilled, a substance that should not have been there at all. Miss Marple sat back and poured her tea. She had known, of course, from the moment she caught that telltale scent of bitter almonds, but knowing and proving were two entirely different matters, as she had learned over many years of observing human nature in all its complexity. At 9 o'clock, she put on her coat and hat and made her way to Mrs. Bantry's house. Her friend would be at breakfast, and Mrs. Bantry's kitchen table had long served as an excellent venue for the discussion of village matters, both mundane and otherwise. Mrs. Bantry was indeed at breakfast, working her way through toast and marmalade with the robust appetite of someone whose conscience was clear. She looked up as her maid showed Miss Marple in. "Jane, I was hoping you'd come. This dreadful business last night, I haven't been able to think of anything else. Do sit down. You'll have some coffee." "Ta, if you don't mind," Miss Marple said, settling herself at the table. "I've brought something I should like you to look at." She produced the hymn sheet and laid it on the table between them. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her face puzzled. "It's Mr. Barton's carol sheet, isn't it? However, did you come by it?" "I picked it up last night when he fell. I thought it might be important." Miss Marple pointed to the damp corner. "You see here, this is where liquid was spilled on it, warm cider, I should think. But notice the residue." Mrs. Bantry peered at the sheet, then looked up with dawning comprehension. "You're saying someone put something in his drink?" "I'm saying the possibility exists," Miss Marple corrected gently, "though, of course, Dr. Haydock will make the determination. I understand he's conducting a thorough examination this morning. But who would do such a thing? Hugh Barton was universally liked. He had no enemies that I ever heard of. Universal liking is rather a strong claim, don't you think? In my experience, schoolmasters, however good-natured, inevitably make decisions that displease someone, a parent whose child receives poor marks, perhaps, or who feels their offspring has been treated unfairly." "You're thinking of Kellum," Mrs. Bantry said immediately. "His boy was expelled just last month, caught cheating on the mathematics examination. Kellum made quite a scene about it at the time." "Did he indeed? I wasn't aware the boy had been expelled. I thought it was merely some minor trouble." "Oh, it was quite serious. The boy had stolen the examination papers from Mr. Barton's desk and sold copies to 3 other students. Mr. Barton had no choice but to take action, though I understand it distressed him greatly. He'd never expelled anyone before." Miss Marple absorbed this information in silence. After a moment, she said, "The cups of cider were left on the church porch. Peter Mills told us that Mr. Barton had instructed him to fetch them from there. Poor Peter, the boy is quite distraught, naturally. His mother says he's been crying all night, convinced he'll be arrested for murder." "I think that unlikely," Miss Marple said. "If anyone meant to harm Mr. Barton, They would hardly use a child as an unwitting accomplice in such an obvious fashion. No, whoever did this was more subtle than that. She paused, remembering something. Mrs. Bantry, you know everyone in the village. Tell me about Miss Preston, the school secretary. Mrs. Bantry looked surprised at the change of subject. Miss Preston. A quiet sort of person, efficient, I'm told. Came here from Yorkshire, or somewhere up north, about 3 years ago. Keeps herself to herself, mostly. Why do you ask? She seemed very distressed last night. More so than one might expect from a professional acquaintance, however cordial. Well, she worked closely with Mr. Barton, naturally. I suppose she might have been fond of him. Yes, Miss Marple said slowly. One might suppose... She finished her tea and rose to leave, but Mrs. Bantry detained her with a hand on her arm. Jan, you're thinking this was deliberate, aren't you? Not a heart attack or some sudden illness, but murder. I'm thinking, Miss Marple said carefully, that Dr. Haydock will tell us what he finds. But yes, I believe Mr. Barton was murdered. The question is, why and by whom? And those questions may prove rather more difficult to answer. She made her way home slowly, her mind turning over the facts as she knew them. A man poisoned while singing carols. The poison had been administered in a cup of warm cider that had been left conveniently on a church porch. But who had left it there? And more importantly, how had the murderer ensured that Mr. Barton and only Mr. Barton would drink from the poisoned cup? Unless, of course, the murderer hadn't cared who drank it. But no, that made no sense. If the goal had been random violence, there were far simpler methods. This had been targeted, planned, and executed with a certain cold intelligence that Miss Marple found deeply disturbing. She had just reached her front gate when she saw Peter Mills coming along the lane, his face pale and drawn. He stopped when he saw her, and for a moment she thought he might turn and run. But he straightened his shoulders and approached her with the determined air of someone who's made a difficult decision. Miss Marple. Ma'am, might I have a word? Of course, Peter. Come inside. I was just about to make a fresh pot of tea. In her small sitting room, the boy perched on the edge of an armchair, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. Miss Marple poured tea and waited with the patience she had cultivated over many years. I didn't know, ma'am, he burst out finally. I swear I didn't know anything was wrong with that cider. Mr. Barton told me to fetch the cups, and I did just like he asked. I'd never, his voice broke. He was always good to me, helping me with my singing, even though I haven't got much of a voice. I'm quite certain you didn't know, Miss Marple said gently. But tell me, Peter, are you sure it was Mr. Barton who told you to fetch the cups? The boy's face scrunched up in thought. Well, I thought it was, but now I'm trying to remember exactly, and it's all muddled. I was standing near the church porch, and someone said, Peter, take these cups to Mr. Barton and the others. They'll need warming. I just assumed it was him. But you didn't actually see who spoke, no, Mum. It was dark, and I was thinking about the next carol. I just went and got the cups like I was told. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Thank you, Peter. You've been very helpful. Now go home to your mother and try not to worry. I don't believe anyone thinks you're responsible for what happened. After he left, she sat in her chair and stared at the cold fireplace. Someone had given those instructions to Peter. Someone who had made certain to remain anonymous in the darkness and confusion. Someone who had planned this carefully, perhaps, for weeks. Someone who had known exactly how to make murder look like an accident. Chapter 4. A Gift Left on the Porch Dr. Haydock called on Miss Marple that afternoon. She was not surprised to see him. She had been expecting either the doctor or Colonel Melchitand, possibly both ever since her conversation with Peter Mills. Miss Marple, he said, settling his bulk into her best chair with a sigh. I've just come from a most unpleasant morning's work. Hugh Barton did not die of heart failure. No, Miss Marple agreed quietly. I rather thought he hadn't. The doctor's bushy eyebrows rose. You thought? What made you think anything of the sort? The scent, Dr. Bitter Almonds. I caught it quite distinctly when I bent down beside him last night. And then there was the hymn sheet. She produced it from her writing desk drawer. You see the residue here, along the damp edge. I believe it came from the cup he was drinking. Dr. Haydock examined the sheet with considerable interest. Cyanide, he said finally. Fast-acting and quite deadly. The post-mortem confirms it. He'd have died within minutes of ingesting a sufficient dose. But how the devil did you know about bitter almonds? That's not common knowledge. I had a cousin once, Miss Marple said, who purchased rat poison for entirely legitimate purposes. Unfortunately, she was rather careless with the storage, and there was an incident with a cake that had been left too near the pantry shelf. The cake had to be destroyed, of course, but not before I'd noticed the smell. One doesn't forget such things. No, I suppose one doesn't. The doctor leaned back in his chair. Colonel Melchett has been informed, naturally. This is now a murder investigation. He'll want to speak with you, I expect, about this hymn sheet and anything else you may have observed. Of course, I shall be happy to help in any way I can. Miss Marple paused, choosing her words carefully. Doctor? When you examined Mr. Barton yesterday afternoon at the vicarage, did you notice anything unusual about his demeanour? Any sign of worry or distress? How did you know I examined him at the vicarage? Mrs. Clement mentioned that he had been there helping with the flowers. As the village doctor, you often stop by the vicarage on Christmas Eve to bring Mrs. Clement her tonic. It seemed likely your visits would have coincided. Dr. Haydock grunted. You don't miss much, do you? As it happens, I did see him briefly. He seemed perfectly well physically speaking, but now you mention it, he did seem preoccupied. Asked me an odd question, actually. Oh, he wanted to know how long digitalis would remain detectable in someone's system. Said he was writing an essay on poisons for some educational journal, but I thought it a queer sort of topic for Christmas Eve. Conversation. Miss Marple filed this. Information away with interest. Did he mention anything else? Any concerns about the school, perhaps, or any of the other parents? Not to me, but then I'm not much for gossip. He rose to leave, then paused. Miss Marple, hope you'll be careful. Someone in this village is a murderer, and murderers have been known to strike twice if they feel threatened. After he left, Miss Marple sat thinking for several minutes. Then she put on her coat once more and made her way to the church. The snow had stopped during the night, and the churchyard looked peaceful in the afternoon light, betraying no sign of the previous evening's tragedy, beyond some trampled patches near the porch. The vicar was in the church itself, preparing for the Christmas service that would take place the following evening. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his gentle face showing the strain of recent events. Miss Marple, what a dreadful business this is. Dr. Haydock has told me the worst. Murder on Christmas Eve in our own churchyard. It hardly seems possible. I'm afraid evil respects no calendar. Vicar, might I look around the porch? I promise not to disturb anything. Of course, though I believe the police have already examined it thoroughly. Colonel Melchett was here this morning with Constable Polker. The church porch was a small stone enclosure with a wooden bench running along one side. Miss Marple examined it carefully, noting the marks in the dust where the cups had presumably stood, but there was something else on the bench, half hidden in the shadowed corner. A small wrapped parcel about the size of a book. "Vickard, did you notice this here earlier?" Mr. Clement came to look. "No, I can't say I did, though I wasn't looking particularly carefully. Perhaps someone left it as a Christmas gift for the church." Miss Marple picked it up carefully. The wrapping was simple brown paper tied with string. There was no name or marking on the outside. She hesitated, then untied the string and folded back the paper. Inside was a music box, the sort that played a tune when wound, but it had been damaged quite deliberately, it seemed. The mechanism was bent, the wood cracked as though someone had struck it repeatedly with a heavy object. "How very strange," Mr. Clement murmured. "Who would destroy a music box and then wrap it up?" Miss Marple turned the box over in her hands. On the inner lid, barely visible in the dim light, she noticed scratches, not random damage, but letters carved with something sharp. She held it closer to the porch entrance, where the light was better. "HB must pay." She read aloud. The vicar drew in a sharp breath. "Hugh Barton. Someone threatened him. It would appear so." Miss Marple wound the music box carefully, and despite its damaged state, it managed to produce a halting, broken melody. She recognized it after a moment. It was the same tune Mr. Barton had been teaching his pupils for the school. Christmas play, a traditional carol arranged for children's voices. This must have meant something to him, something specific. "Vicar, do you know anything about the school Christmas play, what the children were performing?" "Oh, yes." Hugh was quite excited about it. It was to be a nativity play with special music he'd arranged himself. He was very proud of it. Said it was the culmination of his work with the children this term. Miss Marple examined the broken music box again. Someone had known about this play, known about the music, and had chosen to destroy this particular object as a message. But what message, exactly? And why leave it on the church porch where it might be discovered by anyone? Unless it was meant to be discovered. Perhaps by Mr. Barton himself before the caroling began. A warning, a threat, or a cruel joke. She wrapped the music box carefully and tucked it into her handbag. "Vicar, I should like to borrow this if I may. I believe Colonel Melchett will want to see it." Of course. "Miss Marple, do you have any idea who might have done this terrible thing?" "I have several ideas," she said carefully, "but ideas are not evidence. What I need now is to understand more about Mr. Barton himself, his work at the school, his relationships with the parents and children, anything that might suggest a motive for murder." She paused at the porch entrance, looking out at the peaceful churchyard. "The motive isn't romantic or financial," she said half to herself. "This is connected to the school. I'm quite certain of it now. Someone felt that Hugh Barton must pay for something he had done or something he knew. The question is, what and whether he realized the danger he was in." She walked slowly home through the quiet village, the broken music box weighing heavily in her handbag. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a murderer was going about their daily business, perhaps feeling safe, perhaps already planning their next move. Miss Marple thought about the careful planning that had gone into the poisoning, the anonymous instruction to Peter Mills, the cups left so conveniently on the church porch. This was not the work of someone acting in sudden, passionate rage. This was calculated, deliberate, and cold, which meant, she reflected, that the murderer was someone who could plan carefully and wait patiently for the right moment. Someone who appeared ordinary, trustworthy, perhaps even gentle. The most dangerous kind of murderer there was. Chapter 5. The teacher's secret Boxing Day dawned cold and bright, the snow lying crisp across the village. Miss Marple, who had spent a largely sleepless Christmas Day, thinking about broken music boxes and bitter almonds, decided that the time had come for more direct investigation. Questions needed to be asked, and in her experience, children were often more forthcoming than adults when approached with the right combination of gentleness and genuine interest. She encountered her first opportunity quite by chance while walking past the village green. Emily Danther, baker's daughter, who had sung in the choir, was building a snowman with 2 other girls from the school. Miss Marple paused to admire their handiwork. "That's very fine," she said. "You've given him quite a distinguished expression." Emily looked up, her face still bearing traces of the distress from Christmas Eve. "Thank you, Miss Marple. We thought we'd make him look like a schoolmaster in honor of Mr. Barton. A lovely tribute. I'm sure he would have been pleased." Miss Marple settled herself on a nearby bench as though merely resting during her walk. "You children must miss him terribly." "Oh, we do," said one of the other girls, a thin, freckled child with serious eyes. "He was ever so kind, not like some teachers who only care about the clever ones. He helped everyone," Emily added. "Even the ones whose families couldn't afford the extra books and things. He'd lend them out of his own library. Or sometimes he'd just give them away, saying he had doubles." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "That was very generous of him." "Did he do that often?" "All the time," the third girl said. "My brother needed a Latin grammar, and Mr. Barton bought him one from the bookshop in Melchester. Said it was from the school fund, but I heard Miss Preston telling Mum that there wasn't any money left in the school fund. Not after Mr. Kellam's business." "Hush, Sarah," Emily said quickly. "We're not supposed to talk about that." But Miss Marple's gentle smile encouraged confidences. "I'm sure it's nothing that isn't common knowledge. Mr. Kellam's son got into some difficulty at school, didn't he?" The girls exchanged glances. Finally, Emily spoke. "He was caught cheating on the examination. It was awful. He'd stolen the papers from Mr. Barton's desk and sold copies to other boys. Mr. Barton was ever so upset about it. He tried to hush it up at first, but then the school board found out, and they said young Kellam had to be expelled. First time Mr. Barton ever expelled anyone," Sarah added. "He was always the sort to give second chances, but this was too serious, you see. The school board said he had no choice, and Mr. Kellam was angry about the expulsion." "Furious," Emily said in a low voice. "He came to the school and shouted at Mr. Barton right in front of everyone. Said he'd make him sorry, said Mr. Barton was destroying his son's future over a bit of youthful foolishness. Miss Preston had to fetch the constable to make them stop." Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. After a few more pleasantries about snowmen and Christmas presents, she continued her walk, her mind arranging these new facts into patterns. She was passing the lane that led to Kellam Farm when she decided, on impulse, to pay a call. The farm was a substantial property, well maintained, despite its distance from the village centre. Mr. Kellam, it seemed, was a man of means. She found him in the yard, loading hay onto a cart. He looked up at her approach with an expression that was neither welcoming nor overtly hostile, merely wary. "Miss Marple come to ask questions, I suppose. Everyone else has." "I came to offer my condolences," Miss Marple said mildly. I understand your son was one of Mr. Barton's pupils. This must be a difficult time for all of you. Callum's face darkened. Difficult, that's one word for it. Barton ruined my boy's chances, and now everyone's making him out to be some sort of saint. Well, he wasn't. He was stubborn and self-righteous, and he wouldn't listen to reason about the examination incident. My boy made a mistake. He's 16 years old. Boys that age do foolish things, but expulsion. That's a permanent mark, Miss Marple. No decent school will take him now. Barton could have handled it quietly, given him a caning, and kept it between us. But no, he had to make an example of him. Miss Marple noticed the soot on Callum's cuff, just as the outline had mentioned, and caught the faint smell of cider that seemed to cling to his clothes. She also noticed his hands large and capable, with dirt ingrained beneath the nails. I understand you spoke with Mr. Barton on Christmas Eve. Callum's eyes narrowed. Who told you that? Several people saw you at the carolling. It's natural to assume you might have exchanged words. I spoke to him, yes. Told him I hoped he was satisfied with what he'd done. He just looked at me with those sad eyes of his and said he was sorry it had come to this. Sorry. Callum's voice was bitter, as if sorry makes any difference. Where were you when Mr. Barton collapsed? Are you accusing me of something, Miss Marple? Not at all. I'm merely trying to understand the sequence of events. Callum stared at her for a long moment, then seemed to deflate slightly. I was standing near the back of the crowd. I didn't want to be there at all, if truth be told, but the wife insisted, said it would look bad if we didn't attend. When Barton fell, I was as shocked as anyone. At that moment, a woman appeared in the farmhouse doorway. Mrs. Callum was younger than her husband, with a nervous, pinched face and hands that twisted constantly in her apron. Miss Marple, she said quietly, would you care to come in for a moment? I've just made tea. Something in her tone suggested this was more than a social courtesy. Miss Marple accepted with her usual politeness and followed Mrs. Callum into the warm kitchen, while Mr. Callum remained outside with his hay cart. Once inside, Mrs. Callum closed the door carefully and turned to face her visitor. Her hands were shaking. I don't know why I'm telling you this, she said in a low, rapid voice, but I can't carry it alone anymore. Hugh Barton kept a secret that none of the parents ever knew, not just about my stepson, but about everything. What sort of secret, Mrs. Callum? The school fund. It's been mismanaged for years. There's barely anything left in it. My husband, she paused, struggling with the words my husband borrowed from it. He meant to pay it back. He did, but things got difficult and he kept putting it off. Mr. Barton found out last month. He said he'd have to report it to the school board, and your husband was angry about that. He was terrified. If it came out, he'd be arrested for theft. But there's more, Miss Marple. The money my husband took it wasn't the only money missing. There were other withdrawals, other problems with the accounts. Mr. Barton had been investigating them. He told my husband that the real problem was bigger than just what he had borrowed. Did he say who else was involved? Mrs. Callum shook her head. No, but, he said, he was going to get to the bottom of it. He was planning to present his findings to the school board after Christmas. She lowered her voice even further. Miss Marple, don't think my husband killed Mr. Barton. He's a bully and a fool about money, but he's not a murderer. But someone else might have had reason to want Mr. Barton silenced. Someone else who was stealing from that fund. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind working through this new information. The school fund had been systematically drained, and Mr. Barton had been investigating. That provided a powerful motive for murder. But who else had access to the school fund? Who else would have feared exposure? The answer, she thought, was obvious once one considered the mechanics of school. Administration, someone who handled the daily paperwork, processed the accounts, who would have both access and opportunity. Miss Preston, the school secretary. Chapter 6. Tea at the schoolhouse. Village school stood at the far end of the main street, a solid Victorian building of red brick with tall windows that let in the winter light. Miss Marple arrived there on the morning of December the 27th, armed with a letter from Colonel Melchett granting her permission to examine Mr. Barton's effects. The Colonel, while somewhat skeptical of elderly spinsters involving themselves in murder investigations, had been impressed by her observations about the hymn sheet and had grudgingly agreed that she might notice details that would escape official scrutiny. The school was closed, naturally, but the caretaker let her in with a nod of recognition. The building had that peculiar silence that schools possess when empty of children, waiting quality, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Mr. Barton's classroom was on the ground floor, overlooking the small yard where the children played. Miss Marple stood for a moment in the doorway, taking in the neat rows of desks, the blackboard with its mathematical equations still chalked in Mr. Barton's careful hand, the bookshelf along one wall filled with volumes, both educational and entertaining. His desk sat in the corner, large oak affair with multiple drawers. Miss Marple settled herself in the chair behind it and began her examination methodically. Starting with the top drawer, she found the usual detritus of a schoolmaster's life: pencils, red marking pens, a ruler, several small notebooks containing lesson plans and student grades. Nothing remarkable. The second drawer contained correspondence neatly filed and labelled, letters from parents, thank you notes from former pupils, official communications from the school board. The third drawer was locked. Miss Marple sat back and considered this. A locked drawer suggested something private, something Mr. Barton had wished to keep secure. She tried the small ring of keys that had been given to her by the caretaker, but none of them fit. After a moment's thought, she began a more thorough search of the desk's exterior, running her fingers along the underside of each drawer and the back panel. She found what she was looking for. Taped to the underside of the top drawer, a small brass key. It fit the lock perfectly. The drawer opened with a soft click. Inside, she found a collection of letters and a leather-bound ledger. The letters were old, some dating back several years, and they appeared to be from former pupils thanking Mr. Barton for his help. But as Miss Marple read through them more carefully, a pattern emerged. These were not merely grateful acknowledgments of good teaching. They were thanks for financial assistance. Dear Mr. Barton, I should never have been able to continue my studies without the books you provided. Mother says I must thank you properly, but you told me the school fund was meant for such purposes. Mr. Barton, the boots you purchased have made all the difference. Father's pride would never have allowed him to accept charity, so I'm grateful you said they were surplus from the school stores. There were perhaps a dozen such letters, spanning the years of Mr. Barton's tenure. Miss Marple set them aside and turned her attention to the ledger. It was an accounting book, meticulously kept in Mr. Barton's neat hand. The entries recorded withdrawals from the school fund and their purposes: books purchased, school supplies, lunches provided for children whose families were struggling, warm clothing for winter. But there were other entries as well, marked in red ink. These recorded withdrawals that Mr. Barton had not authorized, that he had only discovered through careful examination of the bank statements. The amounts were small, at first a few shillings here and there, but they had grown larger over time and more frequent. Mr. Barton had kept careful notes beside these red entries. Query MP March withdrawal. No corresponding receipt in files. Later, MP states payment was for classroom supplies, but supplier has no record of order. MP Miss Preston. Miss Marple turned the pages slowly, watching as Mr. Barton's investigation had progressed. He had been thorough but gentle in his approach, giving Miss Preston every opportunity to explain the discrepancies. There were notes of conversations. MP claim filing error, will provide documentation. And then weeks later, documentation still not received. Growing concerned, the final entry was dated December the 20th, 5 days before his death. Have concluded that MP has been systematically withdrawing funds over past 2 years. Total approximately £70. She appears to have been replacing genuine receipts with falsified ones, making it seem as though school expenses were higher than actual. Must report to school board after Christmas holiday. Feel terrible about this as MP has always seemed so conscientious, but theft cannot be overlooked regardless of personal feelings. Miss Marple closed the ledger and sat in silence for several minutes. £70 was a considerable sum, enough to ruin someone's reputation and career, enough to send them to prison. For a woman like Miss Preston, who had no family connections and depended entirely on her position for her livelihood, exposure would mean complete disaster. She heard footsteps in the corridor and looked up to see Miss Preston herself. Standing in the doorway, the secretary's face was pale, and her eyes went immediately to the open drawer and a ledger on the desk. "I thought someone might come," she said quietly. "I've been expecting it." Miss Marple regarded her steadily. "Perhaps you should sit down." Miss Preston, the younger woman, moved into the room with mechanical steps and lowered herself into one of the student chairs. She looked small and defeated, her hands folded in her lap, like a child awaiting punishment. "It was an accident at first," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made a mistake with the filing, transposed some numbers. When I realized what I'd done, it looked as though Mr. Kellum had taken more money than he actually had. I panicked. I thought if Mr. Barton found out about my error, I'd lose my position. So you took the money yourself to make the accounts balance?" "Not at first. At first I tried to fix it quietly, but the numbers wouldn't come right. I took a small amount, thinking I could replace it when I received my salary, but then my mother fell ill in Yorkshire, and I had to send money for her care. I kept thinking I'd be able to pay it back, that I'd make it right, but it just kept growing. And Mr. Barton discovered what you'd done." Miss Preston nodded miserably. "He was so kind about it at first. He said, 'Everyone makes mistakes. Perhaps we could find a way to resolve it without involving the authorities.' But as he investigated further, he realized the scope of what I'd done. He told me on December 20th that he had no choice but to report it to the school board. He was planning to do so on December 26th. Miss Marple watched the secretary carefully. "You must have been very frightened." "I was desperate, Miss Marple," whispered Miss Preston. "My whole life was about to be destroyed. My mother depends on the money I send. If I went to prison, she'd have no one." She looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. "But I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. I swear I didn't. I thought about it. I won't lie about that. I thought about what I might do to stop him from reporting Mead, but I couldn't. He'd been nothing but kind to me, and I couldn't repay that kindness with murder. Then who did? I don't know, but I wrote him a letter begging him not to tell the school board. I left it in his music book the day before Christmas Eve. I told him I'd confess everything if he'd just give me time to make arrangements for my mother first. I don't know if he ever read it. Miss Marple rose from the desk and moved to the window, looking out at the empty schoolyard. The snow lay undisturbed across the playing field, pristine and peaceful. Somewhere in this quiet village, a murderer was waiting, perhaps wondering whether their crime would be discovered. "Miss Preston," she said without turning, "I think you should prepare yourself to speak with Colonel Melchett. Whether or not you killed Mr. Barton, you were involved in theft from the school fund, and that cannot simply be ignored." Behind her, she heard a soft sound that might have been a sob, but Miss Marple's attention was focused on a new thought that had just occurred to her. If Miss Preston had written a letter to Mr. Barton on December 23rd, and if he had not yet reported her to the school board, he had been considering giving her the time she requested. Perhaps his death had not been about the school fund theft at a law, at least not in the way she had assumed. Perhaps there was another secret one that even the ledger didn't reveal. Chapter 7. The Footprints by the Yew Tree. Miss Marple left the school with much to think about. Miss Preston's confession had been convincing in its wretchedness, and yet the secretary remained a person with powerful motive and opportunity. The question was whether desperation had driven her to the ultimate crime, or whether, as she claimed, some vestige of conscience had held her back. Colonel Melchett had been informed, naturally, and Miss Preston was currently giving a formal statement at the police station, but Miss Marple felt that something was still missing, some piece of the puzzle that would make the whole picture clear. She found herself drawn back to the churchyard. It was here that the crime had occurred, and she had learned over many years that scenes of violence often yielded their secrets slowly, revealing details that had been overlooked in the initial shock and confusion. The snow had not yet melted entirely, though it had grown crusty and grey in places. Miss Marple made her way carefully to the spot where Mr. Barton had fallen. The trampled area was still visible, a dark patch against the surrounding white. She stood for a moment, orienting herself. Mr. Barton had been conducting the carol facing the singers. Behind him had been the church wall, and further back, the ancient yew tree that marked the oldest part of the churchyard. Miss Marple turned and looked toward the yew. The tree was massive, its dark branches spreading wide even in winter. Its position meant that someone standing behind it would be largely invisible to the crowd gathered for the caroling. She moved toward it, stepping carefully to avoid disturbing what evidence might remain. There, in the sheltered space, beneath the yew's canopies, found what she was looking for: footprints preserved in the snow that had been protected from the trampling of the crowd. 2 sets, as the outline had indicated. One set was smaller, narrower, probably Mr. Barton's. The other belonged to a heavier person, someone with larger feet. Miss Marple crouched down with some difficulty, her joints protesting the cold and the awkward position. The prints told a story. If one knew how to read them, the 2 people had stood facing each other. There were signs of disturbance in the snow, suggesting movement, perhaps an argument or intense conversation. Then Mr. Barton's prints led away, back toward where the carolers had been gathering, but the other prints remained for a moment longer before following a different path. They led around the side of the yew tree, heading not toward the village center where most people had come from, but toward the path that ran behind the lich gate. The path that led out toward the farms and the Melchester Road. Miss Marple followed the trail carefully. Near the base of the UHE, she found something else, a dark stain in the snow, already turning brown as it oxidized. She bent closer and caught the sweet, familiar scent of cider. Someone had spilled cider here, but there was no cup. The cup that Mr. Barton had drunk from had never been found, and now Miss Marple understood why. The killer had retrieved it after the poisoning had hidden it or destroyed it to eliminate evidence. She straightened slowly, piecing together the sequence of events. Mr. Barton had met someone here behind the yew tree shortly before the caroling began. They had spoken, perhaps argued. One of them had been carrying cups of cider, perhaps all 6 cups that Peter Mills would later be instructed to distribute. During the confrontation, 1 cup had been spilled or dropped. Then Mr. Barton had walked away, turning to his position as conductor. But what had happened to the spilled cup? And more importantly, when had the poison been added to Mr. Barton's drink, before the meeting behind the yew tree or after? Miss Marple continued, following the second set of footprints. They led her along the path behind the lich gate, through a small wooden gate that opened onto the lane beyond the churchyard. The prints became less distinct here, mixed with other marks and partially melted, but they suggested someone moving quickly, perhaps running. She examined the lich gate itself, a stone structure with a wooden roof that provided shelter for coffin bearers during funeral services. The ground here was more protected, and she found several items of interest. A few drops of what might have been cider frozen into the stone. A scuff mark that suggested someone had stumbled or kicked against the base, and wedged between 2 stones a shard of glass that caught the pale winter light. Miss Marple extracted it carefully, using her handkerchief. It was colored glass, blue or perhaps green, the sort used for decorative lanterns. She thought immediately of the broken lantern, mentioned in the outline, the one that belonged to Mr. Kellum. So Kellum had been here at the lich gate on Christmas Eve. The footprints of the heavier person could well be his, but did that make him the murderer, or merely someone who had confronted Mr. Barton about the school fund investigations, someone who had argued and threatened but ultimately walked away? Miss Marple returned to the area beneath the UA, looking more carefully at the disturbed snow. The pattern suggested a heated exchange, certainly. If Kellum had brought the poisoned cider with him, intending to murder Mr. Barton, why would he have spilled 1 cup during their confrontation? That seemed careless for a planned murder, unless she thought the murder had not been quite as planned as it appeared, unless someone had prepared the poisoned cider with the intention of making Mr. Barton ill, not of killing him outright. Cyanide was tricky in that regard. The dose mattered enormously. To little and the victim would merely become sick. To much and death came swiftly. Had the killer miscalculated, or had circumstances forced them to use more poison than originally intended? She walked slowly around the yew tree, examining the ground from different angles. The church warden would complain about her disturbing the snow, but that could not be helped. Truth was more important than tidy CHURCHYARDS. It was on her 3rd circuit that she noticed something odd about the tree itself. A piece of fabric, dark blue or black, caught on one of the lower branches. It was wool-good quality, the sort used for expensive coats, or CLOAKS. Miss Marple examined it without touching. Neither Mr. Barton nor Mr. Kellum had been wearing dark blue or black on Christmas Eve, at least not as far as she could recall. Mr. Barton had worn his usual brown overcoat, and Mr. Kellum had been in rough farming tweeds, but Miss Preston had worn blacker, sensible dark coat appropriate for a church secretary. Had Miss Preston been here as well behind the yew tree? during or before the confrontation between Barton and Kellam. The fabric was caught at roughly shoulder height for a woman of Miss Preston's size. Miss Marple stood very still, letting the pieces arrange themselves in her mind. 3 people perhaps, 4, if one counted the mysterious person who had given instructions to Peter Mills, a confrontation behind the yew tree, spilled cider, a missing cup, a broken lantern near the lich gate. The picture was becoming clearer, but it was not yet complete. She needed to know more about that final meeting, about who had been carrying the cider, and when the poison had been added. She needed to understand the timing, the sequence, the precise chain of events that had led to murder. Most of all, she needed to find that letter Miss Preston claimed to have left in Mr. Barton's music book. Chapter 8. The Broken Lantern. Miss Marple returned to the lich gate with Colonel Melchett the following morning. The colonel, a bluff military man with a hearty manner that concealed a shrewd intelligence, examined the shard of coloured glass with interest. Kellam's lantern, you think? I believe it's worth investigating. The footprints suggest someone of his build met with Mr. Barton behind the yew tree shortly before the carolling began, and Mrs. Kellam confirmed that her husband spoke with Mr. Barton that evening, though she was vague about the details. Right then, we'll bring him in for questioning. The colonel pocketed the glass shard carefully. Though between you and me, Miss Marple, I'm not convinced Kellam's our man. He's a bully and a thief, but this poisoning business requires a colder sort of nerve than I'd credit him with. I'm inclined to agree, Miss Marple said quietly, though I should very much like to know what transpired during that meeting behind the yew tree. They found Mr. Kellam at his farm once, again working in the yard. His face darkened when he saw the colonel's official motor car, but he set down his tools and came forward with a resigned air. I wondered when you'd get round to me properly, he said. Come to arrest me, have you? That depends on what you have to tell us, Colonel Melchett replied. I'd like you to explain your movements on Christmas Eve, particularly the time before the carolling began. Kellam's jaw worked for a moment, then he seemed to deflate. All right, I'll tell you. I met Barton behind the church, by that old yew tree. I wanted to have it out with him away from the crowd. Have what out exactly? The business with the school fund. He discovered I'd borrowed money from it, money I couldn't pay back straight away. He said he'd have to report it to the school board, that he had no choice in the matter. Kellam's hands clenched. I told him what I thought of his high-minded principles. Told him he was going to ruin my family over a bit of money trouble. Did you threaten him? Miss Marple asked gently. Kellam looked at her and something like shame crossed his heavy features. I did. I'm not proud of it. I said he'd regret it if he went to the ball, that I'd make him sorry. But I didn't mean killing him, Miss Marple. I meant I'd tell everyone about his precious school fund, how it had been mismanaged. For years, how he'd been covering up for that secretary of his. This caught Miss Marple's attention. You knew about Miss Preston's theft. I'd worked it out, yes. When Barton showed me the accounting ledger, I could see there were discrepancies that had nothing to do with what I'd taken. Amounts that didn't match up, receipts that looked dodgy. I pointed it out to him, thinking it might make him go easier on me, but it just made him more determined to sort the whole mess out properly. What happened after your confrontation? Colonel Melchett asked. We argued. He told me he had proof of everything, that he was going to present it all to the school board after Christmas. I lost my temper, admitted. I grabbed his arm, shook him a bit. My lantern fell and smashed on the stone there. He gestured toward the lich gate. Then I saw it was no use. He wasn't going to change his mind, so I left. Which direction did you go? back toward my farm along the lane behind the church. I didn't stay for the caroling. Didn't want to see Barton conducting everyone like nothing had happened. I went home and told the wife I'd made a mess of things. Colonel Melchett exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. Did you see anyone else near the church when you left? Anyone who might have been waiting or watching? Kellum frowned, thinking. I saw someone moving near the church porch as I was leaving. Couldn't see who it was in the dark, but they were carrying something. A tray, perhaps, or a basket. A tray. Miss Marple repeated softly. Mr. Kellum, when you met with Mr. Barton behind the yew tree, was he carrying anything? Cups of cider, perhaps? No, nothing like that. He just had his music folder and his lantern. And you're certain you parted ways before the caroling began? Yes, it must have been 20 minutes or more before the singing started. I heard the bells calling people together as I was walking home after Kellum had signed his statement and been released with a stern warning about appearing before the magistrate regarding the school fund theft. Colonel Melchett turned to Miss Marple. Well, that rules him out, doesn't it? If he left 20 minutes before the caroling began, he couldn't have poisoned the cider. Not unless he returned later, Miss Marple said. But I agree. It seems unlikely. The timing doesn't fit and, as you said, the method requires a particular sort of calculation that I don't believe Mr. Kellum possesses. Then who put the cider on the church porch? And who told young Peter Mills to distribute it? Those are precisely the questions that need answering. Miss Marple paused. Colonel, I should like to examine Mr. Barton's home. There's something Miss Preston mentioned that I need to verify. Mr. Barton had lived in a small cottage near the schooler, tidy bachelor establishment, kept neat by a charwoman who came 3 times a week. Let them in with red-rimmed eyes, clearly distressed by her. Employer's death. Such a good gentleman. She kept repeating. Never a harsh word. Never a harsh word. Made her way to the small sitting room that Mr. Barton had used as a study. His desk here was less cluttered than the one at school. Mostly personal correspondence and household accounts, but on a shelf. Above the desk, she found what she was looking for. A collection of music books, neatly arranged by composer. She ran her finger along the spine's handle. Haydn, Mozart, Puccini, the classics that a schoolmaster with musical inclinations might collect. Over the years, she pulled down each volume between the pages in the third booker. Collection of Christmas carols, arranged for voice and piano. She found it. A letter written in a hasty hand on plain paper. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully and read, Dear Mr. Barton, I'm writing to beg you not to report my terrible mistake to the school board on Boxing Day. You are right that I have taken money that was not mine, and I have no excuse except desperation. My mother is ill and I have no other way to care for her. I know this does not justify what I have done. I am prepared to confess everything and accept whatever punishment is appropriate. I beg you to give me time to make arrangements for my mother's care first. She has no one else in the world. If you report me immediately, I do not know what will become of her. Please, I implore you to show mercy. I will do whatever you think right, but please give me just a little time. Yours in shame and gratitude. E. Preston. Miss Marple read it through twice, then handed it to Colonel Melchett. This confirms what Miss Preston told me. She was desperate, certainly, but she was also planning to confess. That doesn't sound like someone plotting murder. Unless she changed her mind, the Colonel pointed out. Desperation can drive people to extremes they never imagined possible. That's true, Miss Marple acknowledged. But there's something else bothering Meetha. Timing again, Miss Preston told me. She left this letter on December the 23rd. Mr. Barton was planning to report everything to the school board on December the 26th. That gave her barely 3 days, and 2 of those days were Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, when no arrangements could be made. Perhaps that's why she acted out of time and saw no other way out. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, but her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced. Chapter 9. The Letter in the Music Book. Marple sat in her cottage that evening with the letter spread before her on the kitchen table. Outside, the winter darkness had fallen early, and a wind had risen moaning softly around the eaves. She had made herself a pot of tea, but it sat cooling beside her. Forgotten there was something about this letter that troubled her, something beyond the obvious desperation in Miss Preston's words. She read it through again, slowly paying attention not just to what was said, but to what was left unsaid. My mother is ill and I have no other way to care for her. That suggested financial desperation. Certainly, but £70 spread over 2 years was not an enormous sum. It averaged less than £3 per month. For someone supporting an invalid mother, that was barely adequate and extravagant, which raised the question, where had the money actually gone? Miss Marple rose and went to her small writing desk, where she kept her record of village affairs that she had maintained for many years. It was a habit that some might have called gossip, but which she preferred to think of as careful observation. She thumbed through the pages until she found what she was looking for. Miss Preston had arrived in St. Mary, Mead, in the autumn 3 years ago. She had given her previous address as Harrogate in Yorkshire, where her mother supposedly lived. But had anyone in the village ever seen this mother? Had Miss Preston ever visited her? Or had the mother ever visited St. Mary Mead? Miss Marple could recall no such visits. Miss Preston rarely left the village, except for necessary trips to Melchester, and she had never mentioned taking holiday to visit family. For someone supposedly devoted to an invalid mother, that seemed peculiar. There was a knock at the door, interrupting her thoughts. She opened it to find Dr. Hay standing on her doorstep, tired and troubled. Miss Marple, forgive the late call. I've just come from speaking with Colonel Melchitand. He mentioned you'd found Miss Preston's letter. I wondered if I might see it. Of course. Doctor, come in out of the cold. She settled him in her sitting room with a fresh cup of tea and produced the letter. Dr. Haydock read it carefully, bushy eyebrows drawing together in concentration. This bit about her mother being ill, he said finally. I've been the village doctor here for 20 years and I've never once been consulted about Miss Preston's mother. Never asked to recommend a physician in Yorkshire, never questioned about treatments or medications. For someone caring for an invalid, that strikes me as odd. I had the same thought, Miss Marple said. Doctor, you mentioned yesterday that Mr. Barton asked you about digitalis, and how long it would remain detectable in someone's system. Could you tell me more about that conversation? It was Christmas Eve afternoon at the Vic. Barton seemed preoccupied, kept fiddling with some papers he was carrying. He asked the question quite suddenly, as though it had been on his mind for some time. When I asked why he wanted to know, he said he was writing an essay on historical poisonings for an educational journal. Did you believe him? Dr. Haydock snorted. Not for a moment. The question was too specific, too urgent. I had the impression he was worried about something, perhaps, something he'd discovered. But I answered him honestly, told him digitalis could be detected in the body for several days after. Administration longer if the dose had been large. And what did he say to that? He thanked me and changed the subject rather abruptly, but I noticed he looked relieved, though I had confirmed something he'd suspected. Miss Marple sat very still, her mind working through the implications. Doctor, where would someone in a village like ours obtain digitalis? It's not difficult if you know where to look. It's derived from foxglove, which grows wild in many gardens. But the medical preparation is kept in the village dispensary, in my surgery, and also in the medicine cupboard at the school. The school keeps a small supply of various medications for emergencies as accidents during lessons and such. And who has access to the school's medicine cupboard? The headmaster naturally, and the school secretary, as she's responsible for dispensing minor treatments when the children need them. Miss Preston would have had easy access. The pieces were beginning to fall into place in Miss Marple's mind, but the picture they formed was not quite what she had expected. She thought about Miss Preston's nervousness, her desperate letter, her claim that she feared losing her position and being unable to care for her mother. But what if the mother was not the real issue at all? What if Miss Preston had been stealing from the school fund for an entirely different reason, and the story about the ill mother was merely a convenient fiction? Doctor, Miss Marple said slowly, you said Mr. Barton seemed to be carrying papers when you spoke with him. Do you recall what they were? I didn't pay much attention at the time, but now you mention it, they looked like bank statements or accounts of some kind, the sort of thing one might review if one were investigating financial irregularities. So he had the evidence with him on Christmas Eve afternoon. He'd completed his investigation and was preparing to present his findings. Miss Marple paused. Doctor, did anyone else know you were meeting with Mr. Barton at the vicarage that afternoon? Mrs. Clement knew, of course, and I believe I mentioned it to Miss Preston when I stopped by the school earlier in the day. She was there organizing something for the Christmas holiday, and I told her I'd be seeing Barton later if she had any messages for him. There it was. Miss Preston had known that Mr. Barton would be at the vicarage, had known that he might be discussing his investigation. She would have realized that time was running out, that her letter pleading for mercy might not be enough to save her. But had she realized that Mr. Barton was going to die? Or had she intended merely to make him ill enough to postpone the meeting with the school board, to buy herself a few more days to find a solution? Miss Marple rose and went to her bookshelf, down a medical reference volume that had belonged to her late father. She found the section on digitalis and read it carefully. The margin between a therapeutic dose and a fatal one was narrow, but not impossibly so. Someone with access to medical supplies might know the general quantities, but would they understand the precise dosing required? More importantly, would they realize that digitalis and cyanide were entirely different substances? One worked slowly over hours or days, the other killed within minutes. Doctor, she said, looking up from the book, Mr. Barton died of cyanide poisoning, not digitalis. You were quite clear about that? Absolutely certain. The symptoms, the speed of death, the smell of bitter almonds, it was definitely cyanide. Then where would someone obtain cyanide in St. Mary Mead? Dr. Haydock frowned thoughtfully. Photography supplies possible. Some types of paper developing use cyanide compounds. Pest control, though that would be harder to obtain without arousing suspicion. or he paused. The school laboratory, they keep various chemical compounds for science lessons. I believe cyanide salts are among them, though they're supposed to be carefully controlled. Miss Marple sat down slowly, her mind racing. The school laboratory, another place where Miss Preston would have had access, another source of poison within her reach. But if Miss Preston had intended to use digitalis to make Mr. Barton ill, why would she have changed her plan and used cyanide instead? What had happened between the time she wrote her desperate letter and the evening of Christmas Eve? Unless Miss Marple thought with sudden clarity Miss Preston had not changed her plan at all. Unless someone else had. Chapter 10. The Last Carol Sunger, Morning of December. 29th dawned clear and cold. Miss Marple had spent much of the night thinking, arranging and rearranging the facts until they formed a pattern that made terrible sense. Now, as she dressed carefully and prepared herself for what must come, she felt the familiar weight of sadness that always accompanied the revelation of human weakness. She had sent word to Colonel Melchitand by 10 o'clock. A small group had assembled in the vicar's study. The vicar himself sat behind his desk, looking bewildered and distressed. Colonel Melchett stood by the window, his military bearing very much in evidence. Dr. Haydock occupied a chair near the fireplace, and Constable Polker stood by the door with his notebook at the ready. Miss Preston sat in a straight-backed chair, her face pale but composed. She had been brought from the police station where she had spent the previous night after her formal arrest for theft from the school fund. "I've asked you all here," Miss Marple began quietly, "because I believe I understand what happened on Christmas Eve, and it's important that the truth be known. Miss Preston has been arrested for theft and she has confessed to that crime, but she has been accused in some quarters of murder as well, and that is a more serious matter altogether." Miss Preston's hands tightened in her lap, but she said nothing. "The facts as we know them are these," Miss Marple continued. "Mr. Hugh Barton died on Christmas Eve, after drinking cider that had been poisoned with cyanide. The cider had been left on the church porch, and Peter Mills was instructed by someone to distribute it to the carolers. Mr. Barton received one of the poisoned cups. Sand died within minutes of drinking it." She paused, deranging her thoughts. The investigation naturally focused on those who had motive to harm Mr. Barton. Mr. Kellam, whose theft from the school fund had been discovered, and Miss Preston, who had also taken money from the fund and feared exposure. Both had reason to want Mr. Barton silenced. "But I didn't kill him," Miss Preston said, her voice trembling. "I swear I didn't." "No," Miss Marple agreed gently. "I don't believe you did, but I think you intended to harm him, didn't you? Not to kill him, but to make him ill." Miss Preston's face crumpled. After a long moment, she nodded. "I was desperate. I knew he was going to report me on Boxing Day, and I'd have no chance to make things right. I thought if he were too ill to attend the meeting, if he had to postpone it, I might find a way out. I took digitalis from the school medicine cupboard. I thought a small dose would make him sick for a few days, nothing more, and you prepared the cider with the digitalis and left it on the church porch." "Yes, I heated 6 cups of cider in the vicarage kitchen when Mrs. Clement wasn't looking, and I added the digitalis to 1 cup. I marked it with a small notch on the rim so I would know which one it was. Then I carried them to the church porch and left them there. I told Peter Mills that Mr. Barton wanted him to distribute them, and I described which cup Mr. Barton should receive, the one with the notch." Colonel Melchett leaned forward. "But Barton died of cyanide poisoning, not digitalis. How do you explain that?" "I can't," Miss Preston whispered. "I only used digitalis. I don't know anything about cyanide. I believe her, Miss Marple said. And I believe I know what happened. Someone else was also planning to harm Mr. Barton that night. Someone who had discovered what Miss Preston intended to do, and who saw an opportunity to commit murder while ensuring that Miss Preston would take the blame. A heavy silence fell over the room. The vicar shifted uncomfortably in his chair. You see, Miss Marple continued, Miss Preston made one critical error. She prepared the cider in the vicarage kitchen thinking she was unobserved, but someone did see her, someone who understood immediately what she was doing. That person waited until Miss Preston had left the cups on the church porch and then they added something to the cup that was meant for Mr. Barton. Not digitalis, but cyanide, much more deadly poison. But who? Colonel Melchett demanded. And how do you know this? The evidence was there all along. If one knew how to read it. The broken music box with its message, HB must pay. The piece of fabric caught on the yew tree. The fact that someone had access to both the church porch and the school laboratory where cyanide was stored. Miss Marple turned to look at the vicar. Mr. Clement, would you ask your wife to join us, please? The vicar's face went white. Jane, what has Jane to do with this? Everything, I'm afraid. Mrs. Clement appeared in the doorway a moment later, summoned by Constable Polker. She was a thin, nervous woman with greying hair and quick, darting eyes. When she saw the assembled group, she froze. I don't understand, she said. Why have you called me here? Because you murdered Hugh Barton, Miss Marple said quietly. You saw Miss Preston preparing the poisoned cider and you realized you could use her crime to cover your own. You added cyanide to the cup meant for Mr. Barton, knowing that Miss Preston would be blamed when he died. That's absurd, Mrs. Clement said, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it? You were at the vicarage when Miss Preston prepared the cider. You saw her mark the cup with a notch after she left. You followed her to the church and watched where she placed the cups. Then you added cyanide from the school laboratory, where you have access as a member of the school board's wives committee. You've been in and out of that building for years, helping with various charitable activities. No one would have thought twice about seeing you there. Miss Marple rose from her chair and faced Mrs. Clement directly. But why did you want Mr. Barton dead? That was the question I couldn't answer at first. You had no apparent connection to the school fund theft. But then I remembered the broken music box and the carol Mr. Barton had been teaching the children. It was your late sister's favorite carol, wasn't it? The sister who died 20 years ago, died suspicious circumstances. Mrs. Clement's face had gone grey. You can't prove anything. Dr. Haydock told me that. Mr. Barton had been asking about digitalis, about how long it remained detectable in a body. I believe he had begun to suspect that your sister's death was not natural. Perhaps he found old medical records, or perhaps he simply noticed inconsistencies in the story you had told over the years. Your sister died shortly after Christmas, didn't she? And you inherited everything she had. She was ill, Mrs. Clement said desperately. She died of heart failure. She died of digitalis poisoning, Miss Marple corrected gently. Just as you intended Mr. Barton to die to prevent him from revealing the truth. But when you saw Miss Preston preparing her own poisoned cup, you realized you could do better than digitalis. You could use cyanide. Ensure he died quickly on Christmas Eve before he could tell anyone what he suspected, and Miss Preston would take the blame. The room was utterly silent. Then suddenly Mrs. Clement began to cry. Not the tears of innocence, but the hopeless sobbing of someone whose carefully constructed life had finally collapsed. He knew, she said between sobs. He'd been researching it, asking questions. He told me on Christmas Eve afternoon that he intended to speak to the authorities after the holiday. My sister's body could be after 20 years, they might still find traces. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't. Colonel Melchett nodded to Constable Polker, who moved forward with his handcuffs. The vicar sat, motionless at his desk, his face buried in his hands. Miss Marple walked slowly to the window and looked out at the snow-covered churchyard. The ancient yew tree stood dark against the white landscape, keeping its eternal vigil over secrets both old and new. It's always the soft-spoken ones who fear the loudest truths, she murmured later. She walked home through the quiet village. She thought about Hugh Barton's last moments conducting his beloved carols while poison worked through his veins. He had been a good man who had tried to do right, and his goodness had cost him his life. The snow began to fall, again soft and gentle, covering the footprints and the dark stains, making everything clean and new. But Miss Marple knew that beneath the pristine surface the marks remained. They always did.